In the summer of 1989, I served as a pastoral intern for a church in Albany, Georgia. That's pronounced Albany, in Albany, Georgia. While I was serving this congregation, I spent the summer with one of the families in the church who lived on a farm really just outside of Albany at that time. And during those summer months, I, of course, would commute from their small farm to the church in town. And during the summer, they left on vacation for about a week. On this farm, the family had a chicken coop. And we would eat the fresh eggs when they were produced from the chicken coop. And the gentleman who I was staying with, and as well as his family, but especially him, was proud of his chickens and the eggs they produced. They went away on vacation. One day I came home while they were away from work at the church, drove up in the yard, and I noticed that a great tragedy had occurred. There were feathers and, I don't know how to eloquently say this, chicken remains scattered around the yard. It looked bad. I saw no living chickens around. A couple of them didn't return eventually, but for the most part, those chickens were devastated by some creature. This was in 1989, and they didn't have a cell phone with them on vacation, so I simply called the neighbor and I said, "Hey, this is bad." And so he came over and we were talking. He said, and I said, "Reckon what? Reckon? It's South Georgia, so we'd reckon things. What do you think?" I just reverted back. Reckon what caused this? And he said, "I don't know. It could have been a dog." He said it could have been a fox. Don't know what got into him, but it made a mess of those chickens, and it was all over the yard. I think about that story, and I thought about it again as I was preparing this sermon this week. In the story, Jesus he's making his way to Jerusalem. In Luke's gospel, a little different than John's gospel, but in Luke's gospel, Jesus' ministry really only lasts, well, a little less than a year. And at this point in the narrative, we're told that he has set his face toward Jerusalem. Last week when we talked about the temptation story from earlier in the gospel, where the tempter tried to divert Jesus from his course by encouraging him to take a shortcut. Jesus, in Luke's gospel, more than any of the other gospels, has a sense of destiny, and where he knows, he has a strong premonition of where his life will end. And so here, some of his political opponents, his religious opponents, the Pharisees, also want to divert him from the course that he's taking, and they give him a warning. We don't know how sincere they were in this warning, because he had a lot of antagonism with the Pharisees. But they warn him, and here's the words again. "At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, 'Get away from here, for Herod,'" that is Herod Antipas, "wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me. Listen, I'm casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day, I'll finish my work." I want to talk to you this morning about a fox in the hen house. In this gospel, Jesus has several moments when people try to deter him from his own destiny. The story I mentioned earlier at the temptation. Once again, Peter tries to deter Jesus from going to Jerusalem to the cross when Jesus tells his disciples that it's in God's plan that he go there and that he be betrayed and that he be crucified and buried and raised. Peter's response is, "No, Lord, we're not going to let that happen to you." And Jesus once again hears the voice of the tempter and tells Peter in strong language, "Get behind me, Satan." Remember that? They're trying to divert him from his purpose. Here again, the Pharisees. We don't know what the Pharisees' motive was. The Pharisees are an interesting group of people. They get bad press in the Gospels. It's hard to know how they were. Certainly they weren't as bad, I'm sure, as sometimes the way they were portrayed. Matthew really portrays them in a bad light. Luke just shows them as people that Jesus regularly engaged with throughout his ministry. There were only at this time roughly around 6,000 Pharisees. They were a very small group of people, relatively speaking, in that part of the world, but they were very influential because many people admired their devotion. They were strict observers of the Torah. In addition to the Torah, they also had a set of Jewish traditions that kind of, as they thought of, kind of put a fence around the Torah to make sure you didn't even get close to breaking the law, the religious law. So they said, we'll set back the parameters so far that you won't even get close enough if you follow the traditions. But those traditions had been the main point of contention between Jesus and this small, relatively small but influential sect of the Pharisees. And the key issues that they conflicted about was Sabbath observance, what could be done on the Sabbath, as well as other laws associated with ritual purity. You remember the story where Jesus is not washing his hands and his disciples are not washing their hands before they eat. And that was a no-no, a major no-no for the Pharisees. Why don't you wash your hands? Now, the Pharisees were like my mama. They wanted me to wash my hands before they ate. It had nothing to do with the Pharisees knowing about germ theory. Okay? It wasn't that at all. It was a ritual. And they saw Jesus and his disciples violating it. So there were points of contention that seem a little esoteric to us today, but they were antagonisms. But Jesus would still go to eat with them. I told you about that before. He was a guest of the Pharisees from time to time. Sometimes they had very pointed and sharp discussions. But here they warn him that Herod Antipas. Now, they warn him, we're not told why. Were the Pharisees just trying to intimidate Jesus and divert him from his course of going to Jerusalem? We don't know. Were they sincerely concerned about his life? Not sure. We're not told that bit of information. But they warn Jesus that Herod Antipas wants to kill you. Now let's talk about who Herod Antipas was. It's tricky when you read the Gospels because you come across the name Herod and it refers to different people. So you got to be very careful. The Herod is really a family dynastic name. It also almost becomes a title for some members of this dynasty. The name kind of gets inherited by different people. But the one we first are introduced to is Herod the Great. He was the client king of Judea and the Galilee at the time of Jesus' birth. He died shortly after Jesus' birth, somewhere in the area of about BCE 4 BCE, just shortly after Jesus was born. So when Herod the Great died, there was a period of time where Rome had to decide how they were going to replace Herod, if you will. And there was some internal controversy within the family. Ultimately, there were 4 people who replaced Herod the Great. And they were called tetrarchs, rulers over a quarter, rulers over a fourth. One of them was Herod Antipas, Antipater. Antipas is how he was known to distinguish him from Herod the Great. He ruled over Galilee, the region that Jesus was from. So he's introduced in this story because Jesus has not yet made it to Judea yet. He's still in the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. Now Antipas was an influential and powerful man. He ruled over a fourth. He wasn't called a king, though sometimes euphemistically people use the word king in reference to him. He was put there essentially by Rome. He had an interesting way of several interesting things about him that we should know. His father, Herod the Great, really made a name for himself by being in the construction business. He constructed, of course, what we call the Herodian Temple, the Temple of Herod, the great wonder of the world at the time that was later destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. Herod the Great also built the city of Caesarea Maritima on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea there, by and large where Pilate and other Roman governors spent their time and only came to Jerusalem during special occasions to perhaps divert potential riots in the city. So he was known as someone who invested a lot of time and energy through patronage as well as through taxes to build these great structures and cities to himself. Antipas did the same. Antipas inherited, if you will, his father's interest in building great monuments and cities to himself. He built Sepphoris, the city that probably Joseph and Jesus spent some time working at as stonemasons. It was only about 4 miles from the village of Nazareth. Sepphoris was effectively a Greek city in Galilee. He also built Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. It was named in honor of his patron, Caesar Tiberius. This is Herod Antipas. He had an interesting marital history. He divorced his first wife, who was a king's daughter, and married his brother-in-law's wife, his brother-in-law being Philip, married Herodias. Yeah, I know, they had interesting names, right? It was scandalous. He had married his brother-in-law's wife. This got the attention of John the Baptist. Remember the story? John the Baptist openly condemned and criticized Herod Antipas for marrying his brother's wife because it violated the Jewish religious law. Herodias, the wife, didn't like it. She had Herod Antipas arrest John. They took him into custody and kept him in prison. You remember the rest of the story, right? One evening, Herodias' daughter danced before Herod Antipas at his birthday party, where he had invited a lot of dignitaries and other famous people from the world, that part of the world. And she danced apparently provocatively because he told her that, I'll give you anything you ask of me. So the daughter goes back to the mother, and what does she ask when any wish can be granted? The head of John the Baptist. And so they cut off his head and presented it. There's an image, a depiction of that on the front of your bulletin. The image of John the Baptist's head brought to them on a platter, proving indeed he had died. This haunted Herod Antipas' conscience, because we later find out, when we read in Luke's narrative, when he heard about Jesus doing his works of power and proclaiming the nearness of the kingdom of God, just as John the Baptist had done, Herod Antipas said, wow, this must be John the Baptist come back from the dead. And we're told he wanted to see Jesus. Now, we're not told that he wanted to see Jesus to kill him, though with Herod Antipas, you can easily imagine how that could also be on the agenda. But he wanted to see, he ultimately did see Jesus, if you recall, only found in Luke's gospel. You remember he was in town when Jesus was brought before Pilate, and only according to Luke's gospel are we told this. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas because he says, this guy's from your jurisdiction, from your district. Maybe you ought to weigh in on this. Herod wants to see him. Herod Antipas wants to see Jesus, and he wants Jesus to perform a miracle for him. Like a trickster, a magic worker. Jesus remains silent. Herod ultimately mocks him and sends him back to Pontius Pilate. So when the Pharisees warn Jesus, you're still in Herod Antipas' jurisdiction and he wants to kill you, you better get out of here. Jesus says, do me a favor. I'm paraphrasing. Go tell that fox. Go tell that fox that I'm going to do this. I'm going to continue to heal and cure people, just as I've done today and tomorrow and the next day, until my work here is done. Because Jesus in Luke's gospel has a sense of destiny. He says, essentially, tell that fox I'm untouchable, but tell him where I'm going to be in case he wants to try to pull it off. Because he says, I'm going to die in Jerusalem, the city that has a reputation for killing the prophets, just like Herod Antipas did. Don't forget that. So Jesus continues on. But the story is very important. People have wondered, why did he call him a fox? Fox is used in different ways. In Jesus, or in this context, notice what kind of metaphor Jesus uses throughout. Jesus has a fox, Herod Antipas. He compares the people of Judea and Galilee to chicks wandering around, vulnerable chicks. And Jesus says, how often, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have, like a hen, gathers her chicks under her wings. How often I wanted to do that. But you would have none of it. You'd rather go with the status quo. You'd rather give the credit and the honor to Herod Antipas, who's not like a hen trying to gather his chicks under his wings for protection, but rather like a treacherous, sly fox who kills the prophets that are sent to him and then turns and manipulates and uses the people for his own self-aggrandizement. What a contrast. And there you're supposed to see that contrast. It's easy to miss it. We can focus on the fox, and then we can focus on the house being desolate. That's Jerusalem and the temple that he's alluding to. By the way, by the time that Luke's gospel was written, Herod Antipas had been deposed from power by Caligula, the Roman emperor, and had been exiled to Gaul, where he died in AD 39. By the time the Gospel of Luke was written, indeed, the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed. That great temple that was a monument to the greatness of the Herodian dynasty, utterly destroyed by Rome as a result of rebellion or revolt by some of the Jewish people that lasted from AD 66 to AD 73. And in AD 70, that house was truly made desolate. It no longer existed. But what is Jesus really trying to do here? He's drawing a contrast between his vision of what the rule of God would be like versus what the rule of people like Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was a fox, a sly, treacherous individual who was using his power not to empower people, but to empower himself. Jesus says, I've come to do something entirely different. The vision of God, of God's rule, is one that is more akin to a hen that wants to protect the chicks, that wants to serve them, that wants to lift them up and empower them. What a contrast. We still struggle with this today. We look around our world and we see how there's still a lot of people, some of them don't have a voice, but there are some countries where people have a voice and they still prefer the fox over the hen. They still prefer powerful men, and it's mostly men, who pursue their authority not to empower and to protect and to serve and to lift up people and to make their lives better, but rather to use their power and influence to rule from the top down and target anyone who opposes them. This, throughout the entire gospel, is the vision of the kind of kingdom that Jesus aspired to. It's really the message, the central message of the gospel. That we are, as followers of Jesus, as members of his kingdom, as his disciples, are not to be the kind of people that are so enamored by people like Herod Antipas, but rather admire those who are there to protect and to serve and to lift up and to empower. Too often we've been enamored with that in our political lives. We've been enamored with that in our religious lives too. Aren't you amazed? I am. Aren't you amazed when you look at some charlatan preacher on a television or maybe hear him on a radio program and you realize you can see it. It seems so obvious what they're doing. Most of the time they're the prosperity preachers. Sometimes they're the fundamentalist preachers that we later hear about have used their position to inflict great harm and abuse, literal abuse in some cases, in people's lives. Yet they have huge followings of people who just say, seem like they, like almost like an abusive relationship, hit me again, hit me again, hit me again. What is it within human nature that is drawn to the people who abuse power? It's there. Jesus says, those foxes really don't have as much power as they think. Their power is temporary. One day it will be gone. But he says the kind of power that we should aspire to, admire, and want more of is the one who's more like a hen. Now, when powerful people want to compare themselves to something, they usually don't want to be a fox. But very seldom do they want to think of themselves as a hen either, right? A hen. That's a feminine, by the way, vision of God. They're sometimes found in the Bible. Not enough, but sometimes perhaps. Of a hen. Of a motherly hen. Ever seen that? I grew up on a farm and we literally had chickens. And I've seen a hen sitting on the nest with the little chicks there in her protective pose. A hen doesn't seem like she has a lot of power, but she'll put herself between the chicks in danger. She'll try, even if she gives up her life. And that's what Jesus was trying to do. He was saying, you don't want a fox. You want a hen who, in the process of trying to protect you, will be willing to give up the hen's own self to do so. And that's why he goes to Jerusalem. Because he's prepared. He's prepared to love people enough to die for them. So we all have to beware of the foxes in the hen house. And let's all spend more time admiring the mother hens who are willing to put themselves between us and danger. That's who should really impress us. As for the foxes in the world, they'll take care of themselves.